Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the privilege of studying your word, and we ask that you illuminate our minds today, that we might understand the patterns of how you work in history better, be able better to understand what you're doing in our time as well as in Bible times. In Jesus' name, amen. Last week we started looking at what some scholars call the Exodus pattern in the Bible, and we looked at two instances of this. If you have notes from last week, you may remember what they were. The first one we looked at was in Genesis 11 and 12, how God called Abraham out of Mesopotamia. Abraham came from came in from the north basically, and that was one of the first exoduses in the Bible. Remember that Abraham starts there in but we read about the fact that one of his father's sons died in Attention's called to that. Abram's wife was unable to have children in so becomes a place that represents death, and God calls him out of death and into life. See, if you have wives in they're barren. If you have children in they die. So is a place you want to leave. It's a place of death, and there's motion from death to life in the Bible. Man is cursed with death. God said to Adam, in the day you eat of this tree, you will die. And Adam starts to die. Death involves bad relationship with God. It involves decay. It involves not being able to come into God's presence. It involves physical dissolution and physical death. It involves separation from God. All these things were involved in death. And God said, in the day you eat this food, you will die. And they did. They were estranged from God immediately. And they entered into a process of experiencing many forms of death. The death of their children was a way in which they experienced death. If someone you love dies, you experience death. And then finally, they died physically. And if you live in if you live in the old world, you experience death. But God calls people out of death to life. And that's what he does with Abraham, and that's what an exodus is. That's what happens in the worship service. When we are called to worship, we confess our sins, and God calls us into the kingdom and starts to instruct us and give us food and sends us out. That's the call from death to life. Well, that's what happens with this first exodus that we looked at. There are other ones that come before this, like the flood, but we started here with Abram because there's a typology that we want to see. We come from Mesopotamia, a land of death, and we come into the land of life. So Abram comes out, and he stopped halfway. Remember, he stopped at Haran, and he hung around there for a while, and his father died there, and then he came on into the land of Canaan. So one of the things we see in the pattern is that you get called out of the old house of death, and then there tends to be a place where you stop and don't go all the way in. And certain people have to die off, and then you go all the way in. Is that what happened at the Exodus later on that we'll be looking at in the book of Exodus? Yeah, you see, they came out of Egypt, and they hung around the wilderness. And all the older generation died off. Terah, the older generation, died off in the wilderness, and then they came on into the land. So there's a pattern here. The patriarchs go through it first, and then their descendants follow them. While they're in this place of Haran, in this wilderness area, God appears to Abram again and says, I'm making this covenant with you. And then Abraham goes forth and comes into the promised land. And he starts setting up altars all around it. And we saw that again, is something that happens later on. God appears to Israel in the wilderness after the older generation has died off. And Moses says, now it's time to go on in. So they go on into the land and they start conquering it. Abraham conquers the land spiritually by setting up altars, places of worship here, there, and everywhere, and converting Gentiles to the faith. Later on, the Hittites call Abraham a prince of God among us. He led them in faith. We will see later on with Abraham, we're not going to look at all this, but it says that Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, were allies with Abram. They were covenanted in with him, so they had been converted. So Abraham is building these altars and conquering the land in that sense, same way we do today. That was the first Exodus we looked at. Then we saw Abraham went down into Egypt. Now this is at the opposite pole. This is in the south. Abraham went down here and he got in trouble down here, and then he came up again into the land. So that's the second Exodus we looked at. Now it's useful to see that there's an Exodus from the north and an Exodus from the south. And we'll see these again and again. in Bible history. They both have the same pattern. Why did Abraham go down into Egypt in the first place? Who remembers? This is going to be all Bible memory today. So there was something in the land that caused Abraham to go down here. A famine. That happens again later on, doesn't it? There was famine in the land. And Abraham goes down to Egypt. There wasn't anything wrong with his doing it. What happened while he was down there? Pharaoh attacked the bride. Remember Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between the woman and the serpent, and also between your seed and her seed. So there's enmity between Satan and the woman, as well as between the seeds. An attack on the bride, attack on the church is what it means. Abram says to Sarai, tell him that you're my sister, don't tell him that you're my wife. Which is true, she was a sister. It's okay back then to marry your sister. So it wasn't really true. And remember that according to the rules that people live by, the brother is the protector of the sister. So if Pharaoh had been honorable, he would have gone to Abraham and tried to negotiate for Sarah if he was interested in her. But instead he seized her and took her into the harem. He attacked her. No reason to believe that this went very far. Remember that in the book of Esther, she was given milk baths for about a year before she went into the king. So just because Sarah was taken into the harem doesn't necessarily mean that Pharaoh had his way with her immediately or at all before this was finished with. But nevertheless, he seized her and took her. So there's an attack, particularly on the woman, that takes place in Egypt. Then it says, God plagued Pharaoh, struck his house with great plagues. This happens again. It says Abraham became very rich while he was there in Egypt. That happens again. The Jews became rich. Then Pharaoh calls in Abraham and says, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her for my wife. Get out of here. So Pharaoh blames Abram as if it was his fault. We'll see this again and again. When it's time to make the exodus, the bad guys, the tyrant, blames the righteous and kicks them out. That happens with Moses and Pharaoh, doesn't it? Pharaoh comes in and says, what are you doing to me here? Moses says, hey, let the people go. You're causing all this trouble, Moses. And he finally drives him out. So Pharaoh commands the men, they escort him to the border, and out he goes. Then Abram comes into the land, but Lot's with him, and then there has to be a separation between the two, and finally when they're separated, God appears to Abram again and gives him all these benefits. So the pattern repeats. You go out kind of into a wilderness place, you have a separation, and then you get into the kingdom more fully. Now let's look at some more ways this happens in Genesis. The next instance of this story is in Genesis 20. Now we'll look at that. I do want to get through all these patterns today so that we can get into the book of Exodus next time. This is right after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, this Dead Sea wasn't here at the time, but Sodom and Gomorrah were right out in this area, and Abraham was living here. And when you have all this sulfur and bad stuff in the air, you have to move on. This area, according to Genesis 13, verse 10, was like the Garden of Eden. It says that Lot, yes, I should read it, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the circle of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, which is a reference to the land of Goshen. So this was a really beautiful place here. But now, Abraham's been living near it, but not in it, like Lot. Now it's turned into a volcano. The air is foul. The holy land, the beautiful land, has been wrecked. It stinks. And you have to move away. So there's not a famine in the land this time, but there's a disaster. There's so much air pollution that Abraham has to move, and he moves into this area here, basically to the southern area, to the area of the Philistines. It says he journeyed out of there, from where he was near the cities of the plain, toward the land of the south, Negev. This is chapter 20. And settled between Kadesh and Shur, and then he sojourned in Gerar, which is part of Philistia. Now, who were the Philistines? This is one of the most important Bible questions that you need to know the answer to. If you know the answer to this, it opens up huge amounts of the Bible to you. Who were the Philistines descended from? Genesis chapter 10 tells us. The Bible makes sure we know this at the beginning. Genesis 10. It says, verse 13, Mizraim, that is Egypt, became the father of Ludim and Ananim and Lahabim and Naphtahim and Pathrushim and Casluhim, from which came the Philistines and Caphtorim. The Caphtorims also became Philistines later on. So who are the Philistines descended from? Egyptians. Mizraim, Egypt. The Philistines are Egyptians, and they always represent the Egyptians. So later on, when Saul and David have got to deliver Israel from Philistia, that is equivalent to God and Moses delivering people from Egypt. All the same kinds of things happen. You come out of Egypt. We're still looking at this Exodus pattern here, but just to preview something that we won't get to later on in the Bible. You have to fight these Philistines. God will plague them. They'll be defeated. They keep trying to capture the people. There's a wilderness period. What's the wilderness period in this cycle later on? It's David out in the wilderness. Saul trying to get him. Saul becomes like a Philistine. He starts consulting witches and wizards and all this stuff. And then they come in. The land is taken again. David is established. And what does he set about to do? Build a house to the Lord. And when you come out of Egypt, you get in the wilderness, you build a tabernacle. Come into the land. So the pattern repeats. So Philistines are Egyptians, and it's important. You will see Exodus motifs when we deal with the Philistines, and we're going to see it right here. Chapter 20 of Genesis. Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. So Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. Now you're not supposed to do that. Could have said Abimelech sent to Abraham, said, I'd like to take your sister out on a date. Abraham could say, well, she's just real shy, and she doesn't want to go out on a date. You know, he could have put them off. You always negotiate with the brother for the sister, and we will see this explicitly stated in the next instance of this pattern, but here we're supposed to understand it. But he took Sarah. God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, behold, you're a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken, for she's married. So we have an attack on the bride. Then we have God threatening a plague against the tyrant, the Egyptian tyrant, Abimelech. Now Abimelech had not come nearer, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay a nation even though blameless? Now, that's not the word Lord, Yahweh, it's just the word master, sir. Did he not himself say to me, she's my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother, in the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands I've done this? Well, not quite. But God says, yes, I know that you didn't really mean evil by it, and I kept you from sinning. Now restore the man's wife, for he's a prophet, and he will pray for you. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called his servants, and they were all afraid. We'll see the Egyptians get afraid later on in Exodus. Abimelech called Abraham and started blaming him. What did you do to us? How have I sinned against you that you brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You did these things you ought not to have done. Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you have done this thing? And Abraham said, because I thought, surely there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she actually is my sister. So he goes on. Was it true that there was not much fear of God in that place? Yeah, there wasn't much. If the king can seize a guy's sister. Then it says in verse 14, Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham. So God's people get rich. There's the getting rich theme. We're down here in this Egyptian territory. We're getting rich. The bride is attacked. The tyrant is threatened by God. You're getting rich. Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Settle where you please. Sarah, he said, behold, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. That's a lot more money then than it was now, you know. Silver is worth about 10% of gold now. But back in those days, silver was worth only slightly less than gold. Wasn't as much of it around. And this is a covering of the eyes before all who are with you. And then look at verses 17 and 18. And Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and maid, so that they bore children. So there was a plague on Abimelech. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Now, what's going on here? Abimelech wasn't all that bad of a guy, but what does Satan want to do with the woman? He wants to raise up seed. Remember the prophecy, I will put enmity between Satan's seed and the woman's seed. Well, how does Satan have seed? Angels don't get married and reproduce. So the way Satan gets seed is to attack the children of believers and seduce them into his kingdom. That's why Christian schools are relevant and all that kind of stuff. So Satan raises up his own seed through the woman. He's always trying to get the bride so he can raise up seed through her. And we'll see this in Exodus. Pharaoh says, when you see a boy baby, kill him. But save the girl babies. Why does he want to save the girl babies? So that they can be married off to his officers and his army and other places, and they can have lots of children and raise up Satan's seed through the bride. Remember, that's what happened with Eve. She had 2 sons. One was the true seed, and one was the seed of Satan. Not literally speaking, but if you have a child that grows up and rejects the Lord, then that's the wicked. That's what Abimelech wants. Now we see in the pattern here. You've seen all these different aspects of the pattern. See, some type of disaster drives you into exile to Egypt or Mesopotamia. While you're there, the bride is attacked. There's a certain amount of deception that takes place. We talked about this last week. Just as the serpent deceived Eve, so Eve deceives the serpent back again in a way. The righteous are blamed by the wicked. The righteous become wealthy. They come out with great spoils. Plagues against the wicked. All these things. Now, it's a little bit different here because Abimelech doesn't say, get out of here, I hate you. He says, settle in the land. Abimelech actually becomes converted. And if we were to follow this story out, we would see Abimelech and Phicol come to Abraham and they make a covenant with him at Beersheba. And they say, we want to worship your God. We want to forget about all these old gods we had. And so Abimelech actually wants to have Abraham around. So he'll have that good Bible teaching that comes from Abraham. So there's some variations in the pattern. Sometimes the tyrant is converted. Sometimes the tyrant is destroyed. Pharaoh is destroyed. But now when the Jews come back from exile later on, it's because Cyrus is converted. So sometimes the tyrant is destroyed in order for God's people to get out of Egypt, and sometimes he's converted. Now, any quick questions over Genesis 20 in this form of the pattern? We'll look at the next one. The pattern gets a little bit bigger each time as we build up to the book of Exodus, where this pattern takes many chapters to spread out, unfolds. Look at Genesis 24. Now I want to show you something that's important background. Genesis 24 is the story of Isaac and Rebekah. When Isaac goes to marry Rebekah, they did in the ancient world as we do today, they formed a written contract of marriage. You have one, marriage certificate or license or contract. The important thing that you need to see in this contract is that before Isaac married Rebekah, he adopted her as his sister. So that she is first of all his sister, and second of all his wife. Genesis 24. First thing we're going to notice here in Genesis 24, we won't be able to read the whole thing, but Abraham's servant goes, and he goes to negotiate to get a wife. And he finds Rebekah at the well. You're always going to find these brides at the well. Jesus goes to the woman at the well and says, how many husbands have you had? And she says, 5. And he says, they're no good. I'm here. I'm the true husband. At the well. The patriarchs are always finding their wives at the well. And Jesus offers himself as the true husband to this woman at the well. Big theme in the Bible. So Rebekah is found at the well by the servant. And he goes and he negotiates, not with her father, but with her brother. You always negotiate with the brother. So, it says in verse 53, Abraham's servant brought out articles of silver and articles of gold and garments. He gave them to Rebekah, and he also gave precious things to her brother and to her mother. Now her father is there, but nothing is said about him. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night, and when they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. But her brother and her mother said, the father's there, his name is Bethuel, he's mentioned in the text, but he's not involved in the negotiations. You negotiate with the brother. That's what Pharaoh did not do. That's what Abimelech did not do. But Abraham's servant, being righteous, he does it. The brother protects the sister. The brother and the mother said, let the girl stay with us a few days. Say 10, afterwards she may go. Verse 56. But he said to them, don't delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. And they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes. Then they called Rebekah and said, wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go. Then they sent away their sister. Their sister. So what she is legally is a sister. They sent away their sister and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, and this is what her mother and her father and her friends and her brother said, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s. They don't say, may you, our daughter. They say, may you, our sister. So what's going on here is an adoption of the girl as sister first, and then wife. This makes her a first-class wife in the Bible. There's also a second-class kind of marriage in the Bible where you don't go through all this, and the woman doesn't have as many rights and privileges. When we get over into the law section of Exodus, we'll look at that. What is the Song of Solomon? How is the bride addressed consistently in that book? My what? My what? My sister, my bride. Every time in the Song of Solomon, it's my sister, my bride. Which relationship goes on forever in eternity? Marriage or brother-sister relationship? I'm sorry to bring this up, but the fact is, in heaven there's not marriage or giving in marriage. The brother-sister relationship is the one that's permanent. It's the more foundational one. Eve was Adam's sister before she was his wife. And that is reproduced in the Bible here, where you adopt his sister legally and then marry his wife legally. My sister, my bride. So now, he is the protector. Now that becomes important because in chapter 26, we have another Exodus. So this is number 4, Isaac from Philistia. Notice our pattern here. Now there was a famine in the land. Another famine. Beside the previous famine that occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. So there's a famine, and God's people go out of the promised land and into the Egyptian territory. Begin to see the pattern? Were you aware that this happened over and over again in Genesis like this? This is all the stuff that the people knew when Moses brought them out. This was their background. They were supposed to know this and know how to act. The Lord appeared to him and said, don't go all the way down to Egypt. Stay in the land where I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands. So forth and so on. Verse 6, so Isaac lived in Gerar. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, my wife, thinking the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she's beautiful. Did he lie? No. She was his sister. Now in Abraham's case, Sarai was literally his sister. But in this case, Rebekah is legally his sister. And it came about when he'd been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window, and behold, he saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. Then Abimelech called to Isaac and said, behold, certainly she's your wife. How then did you say she's my sister? And Isaac said, because I said, lest I die on account of her. And Abimelech said, now listen to this now. What is this that you have done to us? Look what you did to us. Man, the guy's just out there with his sister, who's also his wife, minding his own business. And now the king is accusing him of doing something to them. One of the people might easily have lain with your wife. Street rape is kind of common around here. We don't think much of it here in Gerar. One of the men might have attacked your wife, and then you would have brought guilt on us. Would you say there's a lot of fear of God in this place? Not much. No wonder Isaac and Rebekah were trying to conceal everything from him. One of the people might easily have lain with your wife. That's not a town I think I'd like to live in if I had a lot of choice. God has said that he would protect him. And remember, we're not here to assess the psychology of Isaac, whether how much of his thinking was sinful and how much of it wasn't. We're looking at this pattern as he deceives Abimelech. So Abimelech charged all the people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So the theme is here, by implication. There's a potential attack upon the bride. There's a deception of the serpent and the tyrant that goes on. The Pharaoh figure comes and he tries to dump all the blame upon the righteous as if it was their fault. And Isaac and Rebekah are just minding their own business. And Abimelech says, hey, you could have brought guilt on us. This is all your fault. One of the people might have attacked your wife. Then it would have been your fault. Oh, brother, What a bunch of moral standards in the place. So now Abimelech charges all the people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. This is probably not the same Abimelech that dealt with Abraham, by the way. Abimelech means my father is king. It's a word like Pharaoh. They were all called Abimelech. It's a title. Now notice what happens. Remember, when you're in Egypt, you get rich. Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and great household, so the Philistines envied him. And all the wealth that his fathers had dug in the lands of Philistine, in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stocked up by filling them with dust. The dust is under what, according to Genesis 3? Curse. You fill up a well, which is a place of life, with dust. You are killing the well. That's the symbolism. Yet Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you're too powerful for us. Is that what happened when the Jews went into Egypt later on? They become so wealthy and so numerous that Pharaoh took steps against them and reduced them into slavery and finally said, go away. Yeah, it's the same thing. So he moves on, and every time he digs a well, they fight him for it. And finally he finds a place to live. And then Abimelech comes and wants to make a covenant with him and converts to the Lord. Let there be an oath between us. Let's make a covenant. So they had a feast and ate and drank. This is a great ending for this story. The Gentiles are converted. Once again, God's people have this ministry of converting the Gentiles. That's what Abraham was told to do. Bear witness. Through you many nations will be saved. And always in Genesis we will see Gentiles coming, making covenants and converting. How many Exodus patterns have we had? We had Abraham come out of Mesopotamia. We had Abraham come out of Egypt. We had Abraham come out of Philistia. We have Isaac come out of Philistia, all of which are the same. Now, in the next pattern, which is too big for us to read in its entirety, we go back to the north part. Let's just think about this a little bit. We move down another generation to Jacob and Esau. Why did Jacob leave the promised land and go live in Mesopotamia? Just because he happened to want to? No, Esau was going to kill him. So, again, we have a disaster that drives God's people out. This time they go to the north side. And while he's there, he lives with Laban. And he marries Laban's daughters. Now, what's interesting about this story is in chapter 29, verse 15. Verse 14, when he shows up, Laban says to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. That's what Adam said to Eve when she was created. This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Now Laban says it to Jacob. You're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So what does bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh mean? Does it mean marriage, or does it mean a brotherhood relationship? It means a brotherhood relationship, doesn't it? She's saying, this is my sister. Then he marries her. Because if it meant marriage, then it would be real weird for Laban to be saying this to Jacob, wouldn't it? You're my bone and my flesh. They're not going to get married. But it is a confession of a brotherhood relationship. And he stayed with him a month. And now in verse 15, things change. And this is not easy to see in English, but commentators point it out. Laban said to Jacob, are you my brother? And should you serve me for nothing? Now what that implies in Hebrew is, the answer is no. Hey, who do you think you are? Laban takes advantage of him. Tell me, what shall your wages be? So now, what Laban does here is he repudiates the flesh and bone relationship. He repudiates the brother-brother relationship and says, you're going to be a hired hand. Instead of taking you in like a son, and you work for nothing because you're part of the household, now you're going to be a hired hand. That's an important change, you see. Now, when the Jews go down into Egypt later on, initially the Pharaohs like having them there, right? And Pharaoh can't do enough for Joseph and his family. We saw this previous weeks. But later on, there's a change. They don't like the people anymore. Pharaoh arises who does not acknowledge Joseph. There's a change in relationship. Now, you remember the story, Jacob serves 7 years to earn the right to marry Rachel, and then Laban deceives him and oppresses him, and so he has to work another 7 years. And then what's interesting is he works 6 more years. Now, according to Exodus 20, if you have a slave, you can keep him for 6 years, but in the 7th year he goes free. And we will probably look at this again later on when we get to the laws in Exodus. But all these laws of slavery come into play in the story of Jacob in Mesopotamia. While he's here, what actually happens, Laban reduces him to slavery. And he holds him there because he's got a major hold over him. He's got his daughters, and he uses them up. And remember also what happened to Jacob while he was in Mesopotamia. The wages that Laban says he's going to give him are the striped and spotted and speckled goats and sheep, remember? Well, what does Laban do as soon as he makes this arrangement? He takes all the spotted and striped and speckled sheep off into the mountains and hides them. But what does God do? God makes Jacob rich, just as he makes Abraham rich. Every time you go out into this area and they try to attack you, you get rich. And then it says that Laban's sons, who were part of the household, they became envious, and they became concerned, and they were making more and more trouble. And so Jacob talks to his wives and says, we need to leave. Now, there are a couple of interesting things here. When he says to Rachel and Leah, let's go, chapter 31, verse 14, notice this. Chapter 31, 14, Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? He reckons his own daughter as foreigners, strangers. For he has sold us and has entirely consumed our dowry. Now that's technical, and when we get to the law, we'll have to unpack that. But basically what it means is, he's used up all the wealth that these girls had. He has attacked the bride. Instead of treating them like daughters, he's treated them like strangers. Instead of holding the money in earnest as insurance money for them, he's used it all. And so the theme continues. There's an attack on the bride over here in this place, an attempt to decapitalize and disinherit God's people, and so they decide to leave. Well, what does Laban do when they leave? And they book it out in order to get back into the promised land. What did Laban do? Remember? He chased them because he wanted to keep Jacob as a slave. Laban chased him. They waited till Laban was a 3-day journey out shearing the sheep somewhere, and they left town. And Laban comes after him to capture him and bring him back. Just as Pharaoh came out after the Jews when they left Egypt. And God appeared to Laban and said, be careful you do not speak to Jacob either good or evil. Don't pass any judgments on him. So Laban comes. And now Laban puts the blame on righteous Jacob. Remember, the tyrant always tries to blame the righteous? Look at verse 26. Laban said to Jacob, hey, what have you done by deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives with the sword? Why did you flee secretly and steal my heart and did not tell me? Boy, this sounds oriental, doesn't it? Sounds just like what some Arab would say. Steal my heart. Did not tell me, so I might have sent you away with joy and with songs and timbrel and with lyre. Yeah, right. You did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. You've acted like a fool, and it's in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to speak either good or evil to Jacob. Now indeed you've gone away because you long greatly for your father's house, but why did you steal my gods? And we'll have to talk about that in a minute. Notice how Laban puts all this blame on Jacob. After mistreating him for 20 years, marrying him off to the wrong daughter on purpose, pressing him, stealing from him, stealing all of his daughter's inheritance, now he comes along and says, oh, look at you. It's all your fault. Same thing happens every time. It happens in the church. You do the right things, and the person who's in sin blames you. Might as well get used to it. If you're righteous, you will go through this from time to time. Jacob answered and said, I was afraid that lest you take your daughters from me by force. I had good reason to think that. Now, we've talked about this Exodus theme so far. You get rich over here, you leave, sometimes they chase you. Remember all the various aspects of this we've talked about. If you've been taking notes, you can put them all together. Now we have one more aspect of the theme, and that's humiliation of false gods. This comes in at this point, and it happens all the times after. In a sense, Pharaoh and Abimelech represented their gods, and when they're defeated in these earlier instances of the pattern, the gods are humiliated. And now, Rachel has stolen the household gods from Laban. And she didn't steal them for any reason other than to humiliate him, to express her contempt for these false gods. So verse 33, and you want to see how humiliating it can get if you're a false god. Look at this. Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent. He went to the tent of the two maids, but he didn't find his household gods. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household idols and put them in a camel's saddle, and she sat on them. This is not the way you treat gods that you respect. And Laban felt all through the tent, but he didn't find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is upon me." So she's sitting on these idols in that condition, which of course makes her ceremonially unclean, so she's defiling these idols by sitting on them. Now this is humiliating the false gods, folks. Humiliating the false gods. Does that happen in the Exodus later on? Sure it does. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. He starts by executing judgment on the Nile god by turning into blood. He ends up executing judgment on the sun god by putting it out for 3 days. Execute judgment on the gods. Jacob comes out, and he's got all this money. He's got everything. Comes back into the land, builds an altar. The pattern continues. So now we've gone to the north again. Now, starting next time when we go into the book of Exodus, we'll be looking at the biggest manifestation of this Exodus pattern in the Bible, of course. The famine has driven the people down into Egypt. They're given the best of the land down there. Then there's a change in their relationship. They're reduced to slavery. There's an attack upon the girls. Kill the boy babies, but save the girls. There's a deception. The midwives lie to Pharaoh and say the Hebrew women give birth so fast we just can't do anything about it. Once again, we're deceiving the tyrant. God moves. His people get rich. He brings judgment against all the gods. And every time the gods of the Egyptians are judged, the Egyptians come out to these Jews and say, "Look, we know that your God is doing this, and here, please spare me and my household. Let me give you a little bag of gold." And so while all these plagues are going on, the Egyptians are giving all their money to the Hebrews in order to try to buy security for themselves. And so by the time the Jews come out of Egypt, they're full of wealth. Then Pharaoh chases after them to try to get them back. So the pattern continues, and we will see in Exodus references to slavery and all kinds of things. But let's just jump forward and look at 2 other instances of it that I have marked down here in your notes. And we only have a few minutes, so we'll have to do this from memory. But at the beginning of the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 1-6, you remember that the Philistines are at war with Israel. And they take the Ark of the Covenant out into the battle. Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, take the ark out into the battle. And God allows the Philistines to win the battle, and the Ark of the Covenant is captured. And Hophni and Phinehas are killed. Now what's actually happening here in this story is that instead of taking the people into exile, God himself goes into exile for them. God takes the pattern. God goes to the Philistine territory. And while he's there, what does he do? He makes war on the false gods. You remember the story? They put the ark in the Temple of Dagon, or Dagon. And of course how they did that was the ark was covered over with all these coverings that are described in Numbers 4. And the Philistines put this ark in there, and then they took the covers off and went out. The next day they came in, and Dagon had fallen down in front of the ark as if he was worshiping. So they said, "This can't be right. It must have been a little earthquake during the night." So they set Dagon back up, and the next day they come in, Dagon's fallen down, his head's crushed. And of course, what did those priests say? They said, "Dagon." Okay. Bad, isn't it? But that came from R.C. Sproul. That's not one of mine. So, have we had a victory over the false gods? So the Egyptians, they start moving this ark around because plagues have come upon this city. Remember the plagues of emerods and rats? And so they move the ark from city to city to avoid these plagues that have come upon them. And finally they figure out they better let the ark go. So we have an Exodus. And what do they put onto the carriage with the ark when they send it back? That's right. 5 golden rats. Nice big hunks of gold. Man, would you like to have a golden rat? I would. That'd be a lot of gold. And 5 golden emeralds, whatever those are. So it comes back laden with spoil. And it's set up on a hill. When you come out of Egypt, you meet God on a hill, Mount Sinai. They put this ark on the hill, the house of Abinadab on the hill. Then a whole bunch of people peek inside of it and are killed. And but when you come to Mount Sinai, as we'll see, God says, don't look at the mountain, don't touch it, or I'll kill you. They put this ark back up on this hill, the house of Abinadab on the hill, and a bunch of people lifted up the cover so they could see what the ark looked like. God killed a whole bunch of them. That's an Exodus. Only this time, somebody else goes through all the suffering instead of God's people. Now, what is that picture for you? Christ, see? At the Mount of Transfiguration, it says Jesus was talking to Moses and Elijah about the Exodus that he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Jesus fulfills this whole pattern for us. And there's one more instance. When the Jews go into exile, they go back to the north. This is the 3rd time we go into exile to the north. And while we're here, in the book of Daniel, it says that all the furniture of the tabernacle was taken and put into the house of Nebuchadnezzar. And so there's this war. Just as there was a war between the ark and the statue of Dagon, so now there's a war between the temple utensils and the worship of the false gods. And Nebuchadnezzar is converted, but then we have Belshazzar's feast, remember? And it says they brought out the sacred vessels and drank from the sacred vessels, and God killed them that night. So we have a plague. And then it says while the Jews were there, the book of Esther takes place, and in the book of Esther, all this money comes into the Jews. The Jews are victorious over all of their enemies, and they get all this money. And then Cyrus comes to the throne and he says, hey, go back into the land and take all this money with you. And Ezra comes back with a caravan full of all this stuff that's been given to them. And they come back in here and they build the temple. It's the same pattern. There are several other exoduses in the Bible. Maybe we'll talk about them as we go through the book. But I wanted you to have some feel for the way God does this. Because when we get to Exodus, it'll be so big, we'll get into the trees and we'll lose sight of the forest. Just remember some of the themes that we've looked at. In the strange land, God does bless His people. And if we in America today feel as if we're in exile, the Philistines are on the throne, that's no reason to be terribly discouraged, because even though there are attacks, God does preserve His people in a strange land, and He prospers them. And in the future, there's an Exodus, and the house of God is rebuilt. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank You for the encouragements of Your word, and we thank You that You have a better future for us than we see. We ask that we be enabled by You to see some of these things go on in our day. We thank You for taking care of us in the midst of difficulties and tribulations against Your church. We ask that You would rebuild Your house in our land and bring us out of darkness and into light. Now we ask that You meet with us as we worship You, if we pray in Christ's name. Amen.